So welcome everybody. Tonight is the Kelly TUKEE Endowed Lecture in Historic Preservation, and this is co-sponsored with the Center for Cultural Landscapes. I'm Andrew Johnston. I'm the director of the program in Historic Preservation here at UVA. And tonight's roundtable is entitled Landscapes and Viewscapes at Mount Vernon in Montpelier, a Digital Heritage Cultural Landscape Roundtable with Dr. Luke Pecoraro and Dr. Matthew Reeves. I also want to thank Will Rourke for helping to conceptualize this evening. And again, we're doing this with the Center for Cultural Landscapes and with the co-director, Jessica Sewell. So tonight's talk is the introduction of what we hope will be a year-long roundtable that'll be, after this, hosted by the Center for Cultural Landscapes on digital heritage and the study of cultural landscapes. We have 2 more events planned right now, and I'm sure you'll get emails about this, but the first is going to be Waitman Bourne from the Department of History here. And this one's on digital reconstruction of spaces of the Holocaust. And then the second one's going to be February 16th, Andrea Roberts from Texas A&M. And this is on the Texas Freedom Colony project. So there'll be more emails about these. So what I'll do is introduce both speakers. Each speaker will talk for maybe 20 minutes, and then we'll have a roundtable discussion up here with a couple questions that Jessica or I will pitch, and then we'll open this up to a discussion with the audience. So Dr. Matthew Reeves, he's going first, received his doctorate in anthropology and archaeology from Syracuse University, based on his research on 2 early 19th century slave villages in Jamaica. Since completing that research in the early 1990s, he's been active in community engagement through archaeological research. After completing his PhD, he worked in Maryland, New York, and Jamaica, before becoming the Director of Archaeology at Montpelier in 2000. As director, he's created a 12-person department featuring a public archaeology lab with excavations that are open to the public from April through November, brought together the descendant community at Montpelier, and overseen archaeological research that's resulted in the restoration and reconstruction of close to a dozen slave quarters and buildings, along with key parts of the historic landscape at Montpelier. And then Dr. Luke Pecoraro received his doctorate in archaeology from Boston University, with his dissertation focused on the cultural landscape of Daniel Gookin Jr, who lived from 1612 to 1687. He's worked in cultural resource management archaeology on a variety of prehistoric and historic sites, and for several years as a staff archaeologist at the Jamestown Rediscovery project. He was recently named to the National Trust for Historic Preservation's 40 Under 40, and I asked him, and he said he is indeed under 40. People Saving Places list. He has been an archaeologist at George Washington's Mount Vernon since 2011 and became Director of Archaeology there in 2016. He is a co-editor of a new UVA press book, Stewards of Memory, the Past, Present, and Future of Historic Preservation at George Washington's Mount Vernon, which will be available for purchase tonight after tonight's talk. Has that happened yet? Do we see that out there? It is? Excellent. Good. So great. So again, thank you all for coming. We'll begin with Dr. Reeves, and thank you.
All right, thank you, Andy. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Yeah, what I wanted to talk about tonight was restoration, landscape restoration work we've done at Montpelier, and how digital heritage has come into play with that, both with doing digital reconstructions, but then also using digital heritage, recording digital heritage in the research process as well. And so the period we're looking at Montpelier is the home of James and Dolly Madison and over 120 enslaved individuals that lived and worked at Montpelier throughout the late 18th and early 19th century. And the period we're restoring Montpelier to is the early 19th century. This is the period when James and Dolly Madison had retired to Montpelier. And one of the reasons we picked that period for restoration is for historical significance in terms of what we can talk about with the history of the plantation, but then also due to the preservation of the landscape that we've got at Montpelier for that time period. And just as a brief background, some of the preservation for this period comes from the Madison occupation was during the 18th century and the early 19th century. 1844 is when Dolly Madison ended up selling Montpelier. And then throughout the rest of the 19th century, never returned to having such a large group of people living and working on the land. So a lot of the slave quarters after 1844 were abandoned and left to decay in place. So we've got an incredible landscape history that's preserved from the 1844 period. And then in the 20th century, when there could have been disturbance at Montpelier, this is when you have the DuPont's purchased Montpelier. They operated as a horse farm and a country estate all through the 20th century, and they were the DuPonts. If they wanted to make a couple $100s off a field, they didn't need to. They had their chemical fortune up in Delaware where they made their money. So when the trust acquired Montpelier in the mid-1980s, it was essentially a DuPont home and landscape. And in 2002 is when we began the restoration of the house and the landscape back to the early 19th century. And this was with the aid of a Mellon family grant. And this is really when, in 2002, the beginning of the restoration process at that time, what we've accumulated since then is close to 16 years of digital recordation of the house restoration, the archaeological research we've done on the landscape with archaeology. And what we're doing is really combining all this into GIS to allow to combine data sets and then to have give the public digital access to this. And I got to say, a lot of this has been inspired by work that Luke has done at Mount Vernon, especially with the GIS story maps and making this publicly accessible. And this public accessibility is a really important part of the work we do at Montpelier. We have public programs that we run where we have basically engage folks in citizen science, where people can come out for a week and get involved in, bless you, archaeology and landscape restoration and learning about preservation. And making the data available to the public is one thing that Esri is really fantastic about, either through Esri online maps or through story maps. So. But for the actual restoration, how this coincides with digital heritage, we began really looking intensely at the landscape as for restoration with the completion of the envelope of restoring the mansion. And we began this in around 2006 with looking at the front landscape, trying to figure out what this picturesque landscape, how it appeared, in the 18 teens and 20s. And one of the first areas we started with this was with the front yard. We were able to figure out from the remains of archaeological post holes the front landscape that was out there. And then from this, this is really the beginning to start to visualize this in a three-dimensional format using 3ds Max. So the images you see right here, these began with the work on the mansion restoration. And we did quite a bit of work with the IATH here at UVA. We basically incorporated all of our CAD files into 3ds Max with IATH. And since that time, we've worked with Savannah College of Architecture and Design with Chad Keller, who used to work for IATH, to really bring all our research into a digital format that allowed this visualization to take place. And the idea behind this visualization was to try to make in this case, this early 19th century landscape that we discovered through archaeology real for visitors. And in the case of, for example, the pine alley, the plantings, this soft landscape, this picturesque landscape of the early 19th century, we've taken archaeological data and mimicked it with three-dimensional reality that you can do in 3ds Max. And we're looking for ways to transform this into a GIS-based environment through BIM and Cityscape, and working with folks here at UVA on this as well. So a lot of this is really credited to DIAF and the work we've done with them. And the intersection between this and landscape restoration really comes in the South Yard. This ability to visualize the landscape really was only possible through archaeology. We don't have, for the early 19th century, there are no surviving images or drawings of a lot of the surrounding landscape of the house, and definitely none of the slave quarters. So all this is based on the archaeology of these spaces combined with working with architectural historians and developing models for this. So for the archaeology at Montpelier, from that preservation that we through the 19th and into the 20th century, basically within the historic core of Montpelier, when you remove the topsoil, you're down on that early 19th century landscape, not only for the area around the main house, but also throughout the farm landscape as well. And I'll get to that in a second. But in the South Yard, what we have been able to do is, have the physical evidence to actually reconstruct the buildings that are on the landscape. And in this case, this is a shot from 2011 when we had uncovered the foundations for the duplexes for the house slaves. And since that time, we've excavated the smokehouses, what turned out to be a spinning house in the south kitchen. But how we really started to allow this to be visualized, and what inspired the visualization, was the inability to really have visitors connect between some of these 3D images and what was essentially a 20th century landscape. So in this picture that was taken around 2009, we had imagery of what this space looked like, and it was only once we began to create the 3D mock-ups of these spaces that people really began to identify what was on the landscape with what's on these three-dimensional drawings. And what this inspired, first the 3D reconstructions were inspired by the descendant community wanting their ancestors' homes to be represented. Once we did this further inspired the descendant community to ask for doing restorations of these spaces. Also allowed visitors to understand that these areas out here simply weren't trees dating to the 20th century, because most people, when they would see this, visitors would ask about the trees rather than the spaces of the enslaved homes. And also what this inspired serendipitously was a gift from David Rubenstein to actually do the restoration. And so with the restoration of these spaces, what we did first was the archaeology of the entire South Yard. So in doing the archaeology, what we're very cognizant of is, while we're doing this archaeology, we're going to be not only backfilling these sites after we found the evidence for example, the smokehouses here, not only with the fire pits, but also with what essentially was a wooden sacrificial foundation, or a sacrificial sill that the smokehouses are built on. Not only were we going to be backfilling these areas once we found them, and this is what we excavated in 2016 of the kitchen and then the spinning house, is we're also going to be building atop these. So what we're going to be in a situation is we're going to have these, the archaeology used to restore these spaces, and then what was going to disappear was the archaeology from memory, and then also in terms of being a tangible asset that we could use to talk about, the background of how we knew what we knew. And what we started working with is with Will Rourke on, this is a picture of Will right here this spring scanning some of our more recent findings, is we started working with Will Rourke to do scans of all of these areas as we did excavations. And so essentially what we've been able to do with terrestrial LiDAR, basically tripod-mounted LiDAR like is shown here, is develop 3D models of the excavations that allow a tangible record of the research and the cultural resources of these spaces. And what we're looking towards is, as we restore these spaces, look for ways to allow visitors to enter these spaces and experience the archaeological space within these spaces. So for example, with a planter's cottage that we're going to be reconstructing here, we have this incredible foundation of from the archaeology that we've got scanned. And what we're going to be doing is combining photogrammetry, 3D LiDAR scans that will allow visitors to enter into these spaces, and with essentially a module the size of your glasses, be able to look around and see the 3D archaeological foundations of the building while inside that space. So it's basically, we go from, having the 3D reconstruction such as in 3ds Max, where visitors can see what the buildings look like when there's nothing there, to actually having the reconstructions and having visitors be able to see what these reconstructions are based on with the archaeology. And this is really important in some ways to be convincing and authentic for visitors, because a lot of times visitors, when they learn these are reconstructed, have a little bit of doubting Thomas in terms of are these really where the slave quarters are? But when you show the physical data of where this information came from, it becomes a little more indisputable. And this is where getting into interpreting slave life as a presidential home, it becomes very important to be able to present this information. Now, for moving beyond the formal grounds, what we're looking at, and this is in working with the descendant community, is wanting to represent the larger landscape. At Montpelier, we've got about 2,700 acres. About 1,900 acres of those are the original core of the Madison plantation. And so around the visitor center, what we've got are a series of sites that are, for example, a slave quarter here. There's a stable in this area, a work area here, a tobacco barn that later was a threshing house, the overseer's house, blacksmith shop, and then these quarters for field slaves, but also for skilled artisans as well. And for these, about the ones that are in blue can be identified through traditional archaeological methods alone. The ones that are in red have been identified pretty much solely through metal detector surveys. And when you look at the larger property of what we've got, this yellow is the core of Montpelier, the visitor core, and includes this farm complex that I just showed a picture of, which contains the overseer's house, the farm area that includes all the field slave quarters, blacksmith shop, and other work areas, the mansions right here. But the rest of this property would have had outlying slave quarters and fields, most of which today are in woods. But back in the day, of the 1,800 original acres that we now own of the Montpelier plantation, about 1,600 acres of that is in woods today. Back in the day, there would have been about 400 acres in woods. So, and a lot of this would have been open fields because they were being actively worked by slaves. So how we're identifying, a lot of those sites that are in those more remote areas are incredibly ephemeral sites. These are sites that are tobacco barns that are a scatter of nails that in some cases are about the size of this carpet right here. And the only way to locate those again is through metal detector surveys. So what we've been doing with the property is doing metal detector surveys on a 20-meter grid to do a complete sweep and find the sites that are there. And this is where we're beginning to integrate this data along with LiDAR data that we just recently flew from Montpelier into an integrated GIS platform, not only for data management purposes, but then also for helping visitors understand what this larger landscape is and really, literally, in some cases, complete the dots between these sites. So an example of this is in the East Woods. This was a part of the original core of Madison land that runs about in this area right here. I should have shown the patent lines in this. But in the East Woods alone, for example, what we've located on these 20-meter grids is about 4 different sites. You've got 3 tobacco barns in this area, and then a slave quarter in this area. And what this is based on is metal detector survey, where these yellow squares are concentrations of artifacts. Again, these are 20-meter squares, which are about 1/10 of an acre. So, there's each one of these squares is about 600 feet or 60 feet by 60 feet. And when you, within these, what we do is we sample where we have concentrations of artifacts. And of course, what most of the artifacts are in these areas are nails. That's what we're essentially doing, is metal detecting for nails. Because fortunately at historic sites, as any historical archaeologist here can tell you, nails are at any site, barn sites, temporary slave quarters. They're really what, allow us to locate these sites out there. And in addition to these, the nails at Montpelier just happen to coincide with different construction and occupation periods for Montpelier. So basically, all the nails on this continuum right here relate to 3 different generational episodes at Montpelier, and then the final set of machine-cut nails date to the post-Madison era. So with locating these nails through metal detector surveys, not only can we locate the sites, but we can also date the sites as well, which becomes very important for sites such as a barn where there's no diagnostic ceramics per se. The nails allow the dating of this. In turn, what this has allowed us to do is not only place these buildings back in the landscape, in terms of research purposes, but more recently, what we've been able to combine this with is aerial flown LiDAR that we collected at a very high interval. And what we began to construct with this is all in woods today. And with the LiDAR, what was revealed was essentially this network of not only roads that you can faintly see in these areas, but what was more exciting were these agricultural trenches, these basically ditches that were Madison had his slaves dig to divert water so these lower areas could be worked. You can see the last set of plow furrows here from the 1840s, these ditches along here that directed the stream water into these channelized areas. And then these lower areas were silted in from erosion from the 18th century, both from a combination of tobacco farming, but then also early plowing, where instead of doing contour plowing, and Fraser has looked at a lot of this at Monticello, but was more basically straight lines of plowing that allowed massive soil erosion to occur, and these basically filled these ditches. But when you look at all this data combined, what you get is this essentially a network of roads that connect these sites, and then you've got the field areas where the slaves are doing their work. So the future for this, what we're looking to do with some of the LiDAR and the archaeology, is to build a more complete picture of not just the historic home of Montpelier around the historic core, but look at these more remote areas, which is where the agriculture was taking place at Montpelier, and begin to reconstruct these landscapes. I mean, this kind of mess that you see right here is not presentable to the public at all. We're working with the University of Arkansas. You're probably wondering, this looks like a spaghetti dinner gone awry. But working with the University of Arkansas to do 3D reconstructions of this landscape to place buildings, working fields back in order, and then begin to really help people understand, a lot of these areas that we use for hiking trails today were, areas where the landscape was heavily altered by slaves and the work that they were doing, and this continued impact of plantation on the landscapes. But what we're doing for right now is we're making this publicly accessible through Esri's website, and Luke is doing this the right way with a live feed. I did this through screenshots tonight, but I was a little more chicken than Luke is. I'm there for you, Luke. But for this, all this data is online, and we're beginning to look for ways not only to use Esri's story maps, again inspired by Luke, to create these basically storylines where we can tell a focused story using the data, but then also give visitors and to a large degree our descendant community, our expedition members. We've got about 1,200 people that have come on these expedition programs, and they're very much into looking at the data and understanding it. to give them a chance to explore this data live and, not only see the results of metal detector surveys that a lot of them have taken place in, to see, the results of those, but also be able to explore this landscape for features such as areas where the slave cemetery is. And really, one of the goals with this is to really, by providing access, public access to this data, our goal really is to allow these areas to be preserved, because our philosophy with this is the more the public knows about the intact nature of Montpelier as a landscape, the better chance we have to be able to sell these areas as being, just as important cultural landscape features as the main house. And finally, with this LiDAR data, what we're able to do is finally have a physical form that before was really invisible, in the woods, and have it be a lot more convincing for people to understand, how these spaces were used, and then develop, future ways to take advantage of the cultural resources there at Montpelier. So, but with that, this is one thing that I did want to go over quickly is that we do about 4 different sets of public archaeology programs at Montpelier, everything from metal detecting to excavating the sites to lab program. And just last week, you might have seen on Channel 29, we did a log cabin reconstruction. This is part of our Learn program at Montpelier. So, but look forward to the conversation tonight, and hand this over to you, Luke.
And thank you, Matt, for that wonderful introduction to much of what I'm going to be presenting on today. You might be a little bit too kind with your platitudes of what we're doing at Mount Vernon, but I think these 2 programs that we've developed are going to complement themselves quite well. And just going back and thinking about cultural landscape studies and everything, and kind of that golden era of historical archaeology, it was through a UVA publication in 1984 that James Dietz famously said, "The cultural landscape is the greatest archaeological artifact that the archaeologist must deal with." In the Bill Kelso and Rachel Most volume that some of you are probably familiar with, Earth Patterns, that continues to be inspirational to us today. So let's see, go back to presentation mode so you don't see all my notes.
Display settings.
Display settings, okay.
And swap.
Okay, brilliant, all right, yeah, so, yeah, you don't need to see all that. But just in terms of presenting on some of the work that we're doing at Mount Vernon, I wanted to set up the scene by giving you a little bit of background on Mount Vernon as a place, why it exists, some of the challenges that we're facing today, but then also kind of focus on the cultural landscape of plantation slavery that we've been working with for the past couple of years. We launched an exhibit called Lives Bound Together in 2016 that tells the story of the enslaved population and Mount Vernon in tandem. This is something that we had never really done at Mount Vernon before for a host of different reasons, but the timing was right for it. As timing would have it, Lives Bound Together opened up the same week as the new National Museum for African American History, but we like to think that the 2 exhibits complement themselves quite well. And then, of course, the other phenomenal exhibits on plantation slavery that have been launched at Monticello and Montpelier, really kind of taking this in a whole other direction that we hadn't anticipated. So just very briefly, I don't know why this is all out of whack, but yeah, well, let's move beyond AZ Dungy and everything and go to Mount Vernon, the place. This is a painting from 1787 by Edward Savage, showing Mount Vernon kind of in its apogee. As many of you know, George Washington perishes in 1799, so we're going back a little bit in time from the period that Matt was talking about, and thinking about the period of interpretation that the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, the union, the organization that I work for, uses. We interpret Mount Vernon as a place to the year 1799 when Washington passes away. The MVLA controls 423 acres of what used to be an 8,000-acre plantation site, and at the time of Washington's death, there were 317 enslaved individuals who occupied this landscape, arrayed across 5 farms. Now, predominantly, we work with the Mansion House Farm, that sits on the Potomac River with that iconic view eastwards towards Maryland. And if timing permits, I'll talk to you a little bit about digital viewshed preservation that we're working towards. But one of the things that we're trying to do in our interpretation is get away from that kind of great man of history interpretation that we've been so bound to for decades at Mount Vernon, but talk about everybody else that made the plantation work. Not that the Washington family's lives at home aren't important, but when you think about it, George Washington spent surprisingly little time at Mount Vernon through all his civic and military duties throughout his life. So one of the reasons why I love the Savage painting is that it's one of the only visual representations that we have of a structure called the House for Families, this wood frame building over here, which was the original slave barracks for the home farm, coinciding with the greenhouse and greenhouse slave quarters. House for Families put up probably around circa 1734, 1735, and then the greenhouse goes up in 1787. The wings are put on in 1792 and then replace this structure. So it's an interesting kind of period in time that we get. Also, thinking about landscape reconstruction and thinking about how these plantation home lots evolve over time is something that's kind of a paramount goal for us to get at in the archaeological program at Mount Vernon. It didn't spring from the earth fully formed like you see it today and like you see it in the Vaughn Plan from 1787 with the mansion connecting with colonnades to a servants' hall, a kitchen, blacksmith shop. This is the House for Family slave quarter right here. 2 large formal gardens, a bowling green, serpentines, and wilderness areas, a South Grove and a North Grove, and then you have all the dependencies, all of which are still extant at Mount Vernon today, which include a overseer's quarter and spinning house, a salt house, a gardener's house, a storehouse, smokehouse, wash house, coach house, stable, and then a carpenter's shop. So glad I can remember all of those. But, in any case, this is just one document that aids our interpretation, but there were many other things that came before, and we're kind of tying that together with the lives of the enslaved population. This is where we get into the nuts and bolts of things and where GIS becomes so important for us and LiDAR reconstruction. So as you can see, the Vaughn Plan closely corresponds to what we have on the landscape today from aerial imagery. And then this map over here shows you the extant buildings that we have from the 18th century, all in maroon. The other buildings have been reconstructed on their original foundations, but we've got a really nice collection of original 18th century buildings with good fabric, and that also means that it's ripe for archaeological investigation as well. Now, telling the story of plantation slavery at Mount Vernon goes through fits and starts. You don't want to cast Washington as a bad guy, at least according to our board. But the good, the bad, and the ugly with plantation slavery really took place at Mount Vernon, and we see that played out through the archaeological records. So these are important stories that we're working towards telling. These are some images of the greenhouse slave quarter before it was recently redone. This is pre-2010. If you come to Mount Vernon today, at the greenhouse slave quarter, you can see everything reconstructed redone inside based on archaeological evidence from the House for Families that we've redone. And we're working towards being able to place names with actual objects and be able to populate these places through recent research that we've done and through some of our digital reconstructions. And here you can see some of the interesting spaces that we're working with, because as we like to try to tell the visitors, it's almost impossible to visualize that black and white landscape when you're at Mount Vernon today, because there were many spaces that the enslaved population simply could not go that visitors can walk through today. So we like to say that we're accurate down to some of the fence lines that we've got. The Southland fence line in particular right here was rediscovered through archaeological evidence in 2001. We were able to put that back on the landscape. Everything from the gates and spaces that would have been segregated between the Washington family and their visitors and the enslaved population is something that we're really trying to get at. Which is where digital reconstructions that I'll go into in just a little bit really kind of work home. So there again, talking about the larger landscape, and Matt was talking about GIS and the embracing of that digital technology to kind of manage what we have in terms of our cultural resources, and then use that for interpretation, but then also use that with our operations and maintenance teams, so that they're not trenching Wi-Fi trenches right through a pristine 18th century complex. And if anybody ever wants to study systems and relic infrastructure, come out to Mount Vernon because we've got stuff going back to the 1880s and everything. We continue to update that. So we've got it all, one of these unintended consequences of starting the archaeological program. But similar to Mount Montpelier, one thing that we do not have the real ability to do at the Mansion House farm that we control is really represent what plantation slavery at Mount Vernon would have looked like, because most of the enslaved population was arrayed across that larger landscape. So the slave quarters that we have are kind of more formal in that built environment that Washington was designing. So we do have one area that's just a little bit south of the historic home lot in an area that was backfilled. You can see it right here. This was a swamp that historically during Washington's occupation was known as the Hellhole, because frequently his overseers and slaves would come down with malarial-like infections. And the Mount Vernon Ladies Association backfilled this in 1902. So what we were able to do with this space is really kind of highlight what the plantation structure would have looked like. This building that you see right here is a 16-sided treading barn that was designed by George Washington on one of his outlying farms. Here's a picture of it from 1912 as it stood. And this was reconstructed based on documentary and in part loose archaeological evidence because we had to get permission from 4 private property owners about 3.5 miles away from the original house lot to look for it. We ended up finding the brick clamp, which was quite unique. And then a small slave quarter was reconstructed as well. These both took place in 1996, based in part on documentary evidence and archaeological evidence. And this is an image from the MVLA archives of a small slave cabin that was about 2.5 miles away from Mount Vernon that was purported to be from the Washington period. So thinking about the larger 8,000-acre plantation landscape and what we're dealing with in Fairfax County. So I don't know how many of you have visited Mount Vernon or are familiar with the suburban sprawl that we've got in northern Virginia, just a little bit different from Orange and Albemarle counties. But you can see we're kind of this oasis right here that's surrounded by suburban development, most of which went in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s when U.S. Army Fort Belvoir, which is just right over here on the opposing neck of land, was ramped up and built. And then we also control a small 1.5 acre parcel that would have been on what George Washington called the Dogue Run Farm, where a whiskey distillery was located that Washington operated from 1797 to 99, and a grist mill was also found. But thinking about these large landscapes, and Matt showed you the GIS map of the road network that was central to that interior of the Montpelier plantation. That was one thing that we've been struggling with for a long time at Mount Vernon. How do you interpret that? How did these 317 enslaved individuals get from farm to farm? We know about the different family units that existed, and that was one of the reasons why we started using GIS technology in 2013 to really start beginning to tell this story. That's the Gristmill Distillery. And to aid us in that, we suffer from a slight embarrassment of riches in terms of the documentary record at Mount Vernon, but there are still a great deal of gaps, and you have to get creative with your interpretation by looking at the farm ledgers, financial records, and reports to get at the enslaved population where they are on a day-to-day basis. But this is one of the better graphic representations that we have of that entire 8,000-acre plantation. Here's the home farm here. And you can start to see this road network, some of which still exists under modern 20th century roads. But many of the enslaved population would have lived in the quarters here on River Farm, in this location, Union Farm, next to this big barn, and you can see these small buildings. Those of you who have really good eyes, right there along this main axial road. And then Dogue Run Farm, that 16-sided treading barn was located right here. There was an overseer's quarter and then smaller slave quarters. And then Muddy Hole Farm, which sounds like an absolutely lovely place, which also had an overseer quarters and smaller outbuildings and dependencies. And then, of course, the grist mill and distillery tract located in this location here. This map was drawn by George Washington himself in 1793 with the idea that he would rent out some of these farms because this starts out as a tobacco landscape in the 1750s and 60s when George Washington inherits it. But George Washington quickly diversifies and goes to wheat and rye and other cereal crops. because the soil in this part of Fairfax County is absolutely abysmal for tobacco. And he's smart to diversify early on, but he's often at pains to make it profitable. And you can see how much of his acreage is actually held in forest. And for those of you who are familiar with this part of Virginia, it's rutted with gullies and everything else. So it's a very, discontinuous landscape. So thinking about that and trying to repopulate this, we started working, with GIS to use these map overlays and determine, okay, where are the meets and bounds of that original 8,000 acre plantation, and how can we best work with that? And then there again, you can see where the original slave quarters are on the map. And River Farm, the blow up, how they're represented and everything. And a lot of these, using those modern map overlays, and then I'll show you some of the LiDAR imagery in just a bit, better enable us to be able to manage where these are, work with our partners in Fairfax County Archaeology, and luckily enough for us, the River Farm Plantation Complex is on the lot of a local public school, so it's all grassed over. So that space is essentially still preserved, and we try to watch that. Not that we're a big brother type organization, but we want to be a good neighbor, and we're all for sustainable development. So, getting at that idea of where these individuals are located across the different outlying farms, we were able to come up with this map using our GIS and everything, and then determining who was who. And this involved an incredibly lengthy process that took place from about 2013 through 2015, right before we launched Lives Bound Together, to figure out exactly how many slaves were passing through the Mount Vernon plantation during Lawrence Washington's tenure through the end of George and Martha's lifetime. So that really stops in 1802 with the death of Martha. And using that database that we ended up putting together, because as many of you know who do plantation research, names like Dahl and Sambo are quite common in that record. So sussing out who is who and who's where became important. But we came up with 762 discrete records of individuals who passed through Mount Vernon from between Lawrence's inheritance, 1745 to 1802. So that's an awful lot of people that are spread out across Washington's land holdings, and then Martha Dandridge Custis's estates, which are a little bit further south near New Kent County and in Williamsburg and Yorktown. So just go through this very quickly because I want to get to the fun tech bits. So I'm going to attempt to do a live demo with a story map to show you how we've used some of our archaeological evidence and our technology, and we'll see if I fall flat on my face or if it's a big success. So one thing that we ended up doing before we launched the Lives Bound Together exhibit was launch into a multi-year investigation of the slave cemetery at George Washington's Mount Vernon. Now, for those of you who have visited the estate, you'll note that the slave cemetery is approximately 400 feet south of George Washington's new tomb, where George and Martha were placed in 1831. And it was kind of a mystery as to when the slave cemetery started to be used. There was a lot of debate. There's very little documentary evidence that surrounds the use of this location. Some folks thought as early as 1760, but the more that we've gotten into the archaeological investigations, it appears to be a post-George Washington period landscape that we have over here, which is really interesting because the story of Mount Vernon doesn't stop at 1799, and the slaves who are emancipated outright with George Washington's death, that's approximately 127 people. We're still working through the lists, and people like to fight over that, so if you want to get Mount Vernon historians riled up, talk about those numbers. But it's interesting because there still are familial ties between the slaves that are still kept by Martha Washington and the later Custis heirs who go on to establish their homesteads at Arlington House, where Arlington National Cemetery is today, Tudor Place, which is in Georgetown. These are all Custis family locations, so they all have ties back to Mount Vernon. And ultimately, we think that the slave cemetery at Mount Vernon might be the final resting place of some of these other individuals and family units. So being able to investigate that concurrently while we have the exhibit on plantation slavery up is great. But as many of you who know about the nature of archaeological research, it can be an awful long time before you finally produce a report. So because this is a public-facing project, we run this excavation June through October, largely with volunteer help supervised by Mount Vernon staff archaeologists. We wanted to have something that the people who were participating in the dig could come back to, and that also the public who was visiting it could also see in action too. So we deployed a platform that's run through Esri ArcGIS. This is called the Story Map, and Forgotten No Longer is the splash page for this. We launched this at the tail end of 2014 after we began our project, and I'll just go through this really quickly, but please go online, check it out. You can link to this directly through the Mount Vernon webpage, or if you just do a web search for Forgotten No Longer, I beta tested that right before this presentation. Forgotten No Longer story map, this is the first thing that pops up, so you'll be able to find it just doing a basic web search. But the beauty of the story map platform is it enables you to briefly tell the story that you're trying to convey, and then also embed very rich imagery and everything in real time as well. This is incredibly easy to update. So what we did was kind of lay out the framework for why we started doing the archaeological investigation, the basic questions that we were setting out to ask, and then we were able to provide some good imagery, good background history, but then also get into some of the archaeological data. So a little bit about who might be buried there. Frank and Billy Lee were enslaved brothers. Billy Lee is famously portrayed in the Peel painting here with Washington. He accompanied Washington on campaigns throughout the Revolutionary War. And then we think the last interment was an individual named Westford, who was enslaved to George Washington's nephew, Bushrod Washington. I'm sure everybody's heard of him, who inherits the property after Martha passes away. And Westford, we believe, is the last interment in 1863 in that cemetery. And it's also a great platform because you can directly link to some of the historical documents, but then also put in historic maps that you can interact with and move around. And here, this is the only known representation that we have of the slave cemetery from 1855, which depicts it in this bird's eye from Currier and Ives. But it's a great platform, and it's nice to be able to embed some of that documentary text in there as well. So getting to the archaeological data and where it really became a lot of fun, the only work that had been done prior to our excavation that we began in 2014 was in 1984, there was a year-long survey that was conducted by the Virginia Research Center for Archaeology, which was controlled by the State Historic Preservation Office at the time. They were invited out by the MVLA to see if there were any historic resources out there that were worth saving. And on the 423 acres, the VRCA discovered 36 discrete archaeological sites all over the property, many prehistoric sites, others that dated to the 20th century and the MVLA period history. And they did some ground-penetrating radar in the slave cemetery. This is the paper map that you can see. The technician located 51 soil anomalies, but he was never able to go out there and ground truth them. So we began doing that. So we overlaid the 1984 map onto our GIS, and the way that we're working in the slave cemetery is we had GIS generate random 5-foot by 5-foot excavation units. So we weren't privileging landscape and space and slope and things like that. And then when we got a positive hit for a grave shaft, we just expanded it out, and then as a result, we ended up with a massive open area excavation out there. And we have uncovered 72 burials to date, and we've uncovered only about a quarter of the slave cemetery. But we were able to go ahead and we'll just zoom out a little bit. Our entire archaeological GIS base map is embedded in this story map, although we've only really focused on the slave cemetery and populated that. So you can see the the blocks where the ground penetrating radar was run, and then zoom in to see our excavation area. And we've got this nice kind of swipe, toggle bar that you can drag across. And with the key, you can see where the reliable readings were in 1984 versus the burials that we found, and then the less reliable readings, which we have later found out are Native American features. So that's kind of a neat feature where you're able to bring in that technology right away, so it becomes not just a pretty way to view the results of the excavation, but adds a little bit of meat to it as well. And one thing that we were also able to do was, this is great. It's nice to have a fast connection here too, because normally this is where the whole thing falls apart. But we were able to, add some 3D imagery so you could actually see the topography. And let me see if I can do that here. And really get a sense for the fact that you are on a ridge overlooking the Potomac. So this is kind of neat. We're still playing around with it. That area called the Hellhole is just right down here. So in the 18th century, or late 18th, early 19th century, when we think this space was being used, this all would have been a swamp. So it would have been a really kind of secluded space. But then we've also done it up so that you can click on each individual grave shaft. You can see the length and the width, the year that we found it, and then also a photo of the burial itself. So it's almost like an interactive site report, and we're hoping to be able to link a little bit more data to that over time. And then we've also added some artifact photos and everything, some of which relate to earlier excavations that we've done on enslaved sites at Mount Vernon, predominantly the House for Families. This cufflink button that we recovered is an exact match to one that we recovered from a good 1780 to 1792 context in the House for Families. And then a couple buttons, and then of course we've got prehistoric artifacts, and just to add more fun, we put a 3D model up there too, so to make it come alive. Right. You don't want to. We won't frighten anybody with the chopping edge of the celt, but it really does reveal the potential for the story map and everything that you can do with it. And we also, to have even more fun, embedded some drone footage that we took in 2015 of the whole space. So it's a really great platform. One thing that we want to do is not to invest a whole ton in technology on site, but enable the public who visit us to be able to access this on their mobile devices and everything. So we have QR codes out there. We do have a dedicated tablet when we're in the field, so we can point people in the direction of this. So that way the archaeological investigation kind of lives on even after the visitor's already left the space as well, which I think is a pretty good takeaway, because Matt, I think, basically hinted on the augmented reality and everything that you're thinking about doing. I don't know if anybody's been down to Highland to see the art glass, the 3D glasses and everything that are being deployed there. We're in the beta testing phase of using art glass augmented reality at Mount Vernon. It's interesting. I'll leave it at that. If anybody wants my personal opinion on it, I will freely share that. But this was easy technology for us to invest in with very low overhead, and this just took archaeological staff time. We've got a small shop. There are 6 of us that are full-time, but we do have a dedicated GIS analyst who does nothing but kind of take our information and input it into our database so we can produce things like this. So I encourage you to check out the story map and Forgotten No Longer, and I just want to briefly, with the time that I've got left, show you a little bit about the use of LiDAR that we've deployed at Mount Vernon, similar to what Matt's done, and show you how that's kind of paid dividends. So I'll just display settings. Okay, here we are. So as I mentioned, we control 423 acres of what used to be that 8,000-acre plantation complex, and portions of this are built on, but there's an awful lot that we can't go into and investigate, the Dogue Run Farm in particular, because in World War I, U.S. Army, Fort Belvoir decided that they wanted to train artillerymen out there and reconstruct the Western Front. So we've got an awful lot of unexploded ordnance in an area where there's a known slave quarter and also a 2.5-mile mill race that would have powered that grist mill that we've got. So I'll go through this quickly so you can actually see the LiDAR imagery that we acquired. So similar to what Matt showed you, in 2015 we were fortunate enough to have a donor agree to fund an 8,000-acre LiDAR flight where 16 points for every square foot was taken as a return to be able to enable us to work with the 8,000-acre plantation landscape and really see what was still extant out there and work towards better preservation. So this is just one slide of the area that was known as the Dogue Run Farm that's now all closed off to us and everything. But you can see that there are surviving field boundary ditches out here, and also sections of a relict road system that passes right through. Now, whether this is George Washington or a little bit later is still up for debate, but we're working on that with that 1793 map and being able to better work with that. But the accuracy is absolutely incredible. You can see furrows from plowing and everything. And then what we're able to do is have a look at the point cloud. So this is this cross section of the ditch right here, and get a good accurate representation of the width of it, the contours of it and everything else, and really begin to kind of work with this. And this is some aerial imagery that we had from 1913. There was a U.S. Army Air Corps base that was not far from Mount Vernon, so they used to frequently do test flights and everything to try to perfect this technology. But the landscape in this particular section of the farm changed relatively little, right up until present, which we're very fortunate to have. And this is modern ortho photography. So along with the LiDAR imagery, we got that as well. So you can see these ditches and everything else. This ditch is another section. As you can see, this butts up against a modern housing development and another farm, but a very different structure than what you see with the other ditch and berm. And this is also depicted on that 1793 map. So we're learning a little bit more about the different field boundaries and delineations that we have. And then my favorite one is this double ditch that you can see in the ortho photography. There again, for whatever reason, this small pocket of land was preserved, and the Fairfax County Fire Department owns it. I don't know why, but hopefully it won't get built on. But this would have been portions of the western boundary of George Washington's property that he shared with George Mason. So while these two are both founding fathers, they had a ridiculously contentious relationship, so much so to the point where in George Washington's will and testament, he makes it certain that he spells out that the boundary between his property and Mason's property remained delineated, 40 feet in width, with a road running down the center, ditches on either side, and palisades on the top of this. This is quite the run. So I'd really like to know more about that story, but in any case, we're able to have a good graphic representation of what this ditch appeared like in 2015. And this is also remarkably intact. So we've been working with the Virginia Department of Historic Resources to get these designated as archaeological sites and preserved, so that can help stymie some adverse development and growth in this particular area. And there's how it shows up on the LiDAR imagery, which is quite good. But even in this suburban context, if you were to go out there and do traditional pedestrian survey, it would take an awful lot of time and effort to be able to locate these features. And now that we've got it in this type of format, we're able to go out there and investigate it for ourselves much more rapidly. And I think you'll see these developments taking place in the Mayan world and everywhere else, and it's becoming more and more approachable and accessible. So if I've got a little bit more time, I just want to briefly introduce what we also do with Viewshed Preservation, so if people aren't completely sick of it yet. One other thing that I do in my role of Director of Archeology at Mount Vernon is I manage George Washington's viewshed, and I don't know how much folks know about viewshed preservation, but just to give you a sense for kind of where we're located. Across the Potomac River into Maryland, it's about a mile across the Potomac. We have two counties, Prince George's and Charles counties. And this area was traditionally rural during George Washington's lifetime. It would have been held together by small farmers, mostly planting tobacco. And this watercolor by Benjamin Henry Latrobe in 1796 shows the Washington family at their leisure with George at his transit surveying to perpetuate that even further. But Washington wrote in 1793 that no plantation in North America was more pleasantly situated than this. So towards that end, viewshed preservation has been a paramount goal of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association of the Union, And in 1955, we started to get the first kind of rumblings of developmental threat because this is only about 14 miles south of Washington, D.C. So population increases and everything kind of started pushing in the 1950s. And just very briefly, there was an oil tank farm that was proposed to go in right across from Mount Vernon. Standard Oil wanted to put that in. We had a very forward-thinking board member who was also a congresswoman and someone who was not to be trifled with, Frances Payne Bolton. And this is her with then Secretary of the Interior, Stuart Udall. And she got into land conservation relatively early on, not strictly for the natural resources, but for the idea to preserve the view. And this was something that had never been done in Park Service history before. But in 1961, after that tank farm was quashed and after a sewage treatment plant was quashed, even though the WSSC said that they would make the sewage treatment plant look like a mirror image of Mount Vernon across the way, wasn't palatable to the board. Public law was passed establishing Piscataway National Park, which you can see on the Maryland foreshore. What this was essentially 2,292 acres of riverfront property that was protected under National Park Service care that has since grown now to approximately 5,023 acres, which expanded a little bit south. Got a better slide of this. Here we are. And we manage this with GIS too. You know, so you've got some private scenic easements here. There are 415 private properties that all have scenic easements placed on them that essentially preserve George Washington's iconic view. And this is a really unique partnership between the National Park Service, who controls Piscataway National here, including an important Native American site and burial ground at Mockley Point, and then Fort Washington, which is a 19th century masonry construction. There's a colonial farm over here, and then Marshall Hall, which is another great 18th century site on the other side. And Mount Vernon has worked diligently to protect that. Over time, you know, it's become more and more difficult. And in fact, last week we were able to stop, you know, what had been a year-long campaign and a battle with Dominion Energy. Dominion Energy wanted to put a natural gas compressor station site on property that they owned right here. All of this is protected land. It bordered the Viewshed area, and that was a rather, I don't want to say it was a bitter battle, because after we launched our national campaign to kind of put the brakes on this, Dominion capitulated after 5 days and said they would move it. So power of public pressure and the fiery sword of George Washington there, but doesn't always work, as we've seen with many viewshed fights. But in order to better protect this viewshed, we've deployed a lot of technology, and I'm not going to go through all the LiDAR and everything else. If anybody's interested, I can talk about this a little bit more, but we do have a public-facing tool that I'm going to get to here that we worked with the Chesapeake Conservancy to construct, and this is a visibility analysis calculator. So what it does is it takes into consideration the view from Mount Vernon, which is located right here, and we'll go back and run that again. And this was all done through LiDAR imagery that was taken in 2016. And what it does is it shows us the trees that are important for screening development in the viewshed area, and if a structure was built at a height of about 36 feet on a ridge line with topography, what would be visible and what areas of tree screening are important to protect this important viewshed. So this is something that's publicly accessible. You can see the web address for the Chesapeake Conservancy right there, so you can check out the viewshed calculator for yourself. But it's a really great public-facing tool that we've shared with a lot of developers. We work with the local power company, Southern Maryland Electrical Co-op, now consults us anytime they put up a transmission line. Prince George's County has recently put a moratorium on cell phone towers, so luckily we don't have to worry about that anymore. But entities like Dominion Energy who want to put up other utility structures that are going to have vent stacks and everything, you know, we use this tool as kind of our first line of defense when we catch wind of those developments. And as we found out with this particular viewshed battle, the stack height, while it wouldn't have been directly visible through the tree line, it was close enough to the top of the tree canopy where any exhaust would have been seen. So that was one of our primary reasons for you know, kind of going against this. So there's more viewshed analysis. It's really quite good with the gradient. Yeah, it's a very colorful map. But you can see the gradient where there are important areas of tree canopy and what we really try to preserve and protect. And luckily, most of it already is under protection. But I'll just quickly pass through because I want to show you one more tool, which is very simple. I'm almost done. Going back to story maps again and educating the public about the easements and what they have on their property, because the National Park Service is they're the responsible body for enforcing these easements. But many of them were put in place between 1966 and 1970. So those original easement holders and property owners have largely moved on, and properties being resold. And under Maryland real estate law, the realtors aren't required to let folks know that they have conservation and scenic easements on their property if they go back in excess of 40 years, which all of ours do. So once a year, we take the simple step of mailing a postcard with a web address and a QR code that links you directly to this single pane story map where we have all the pieces of property that make up Piscataway National Park and all the scenic easements on them. You can see the story of the park, and this is it. It's just the one single pane. But then you can click on each one of these parcels, and your easement will pop right up, so you can see the letter of the law and what's enforceable and what's not. So just a couple of different ways that we're working with technology as we work with our large cultural landscape at Mount Vernon. There's an awful lot more that we're working on and much more that we're continuing to develop. But this is just hopefully gives you a little bit of a taste of what we're doing up there in Fairfax County. Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to come on up here. Okay, actually, let me turn off the screen so we don't have that. So thank you both very much. Given the timing, I'm actually not going to ask too many questions myself. Is that working? Yes. But instead, leave some space for the audience to ask questions. One of the things that really struck me was the really wide range, both of tools you're using and reasons you're using them, right? So the contrast or the relationship between the public-facing elements, right? That there are a lot of elements that are really about communicating in very different, communicating to landowners, communicating to visitors, communicating to people who might just be curious about it but are somewhere far away, and the tools you're using to actually learn what's here. Where do we do our next bit of digging, right? For example. So that was one of the things I found particularly interesting, right? Sort of how do you work to put those different kinds of technologies together, right? So clearly story maps are one of those tools, right, that allows you to begin to bring that together. So do we have any questions in the audience? Do you have questions for each other? Or comments for each other?
Yeah, the great thing about the story maps and also the LiDAR is in so many cases, even, and I'm sure Luke will second this, is even on the plantation, as you will, when we're working on an archaeology site and it's an active dig, people understand that's a site. But when you're gone from that site and it's backfilled and there are other areas that we know are archaeology sites, but in some cases, the management, the maintenance crew does not see it as a site. And so with the LiDAR, what the GIS allows, and this is what we're working towards, and I'd be curious how, since you've got about 4 years of a head start on this, is how you've been able to use within Mount Vernon itself to allow maintenance staff to be able to better own the archaeological resources, because that's something we want to go towards, is have this GIS not just be within the archaeology department, but have all groups at Montpelier be able to use it, and then this will preempt any kind of disturbance that might happen where, there's a backhoe on we just heard, whenever I hear diesel at Montpelier, I'm riding my bike to where that diesel sound is coming from, because a lot of times it'll be like, we're just moving a little bit of soil. It's only like 6 inches off the top of this hill, and it's like heart attack. But hopefully with GIS, this would give, people love to explore the landscape they work and live on, and GIS allows that, and it gives people ownership over some of these sites. So have you seen any of that? And we're at the infancy with GIS at Montpelier.
Yeah, right. Well, I think that's an important point that Matt brings up. The LiDAR, when we ended up getting that funded, it took an awful lot of massaging and smoothing to get the language just right. And we wanted to make sure that there was buy-in from our operations and maintenance team too. Mount Vernon employs, give or take 600 employees annually. That usually spikes in the summertime when we're dealing with more visitors and everything for our history interp team. But as you can imagine, and as I hinted on, the infrastructure that we need to be able to host the over 1 million visitors we get annually to Mount Vernon, it takes its toll on the landscape. So to be able to allow our maintenance division to respond to problems very quickly, the LiDAR has become, kind of their first line of defense. And I'll give you a good example of that. Last year in August of 2017, August 11th to be exact, which is a date will live in my mind for quite some time, we had a catastrophic storm which dumped about 6 inches of rain on Mount Vernon, just right above the plantation, for a sustained period. And sections of an architectural ha-ha wall, which faced east out towards the Potomac, is on a very steep slope that's 127 feet above sea level. The slope gave way in a rotational slide, so kind of a shallow failure and everything, but it took out a section of that ha-ha wall about 80 feet and then caused a massive landslide into an area that George Washington had protected as a deer park in the 1790s. We don't have any tame deer anymore. It didn't work. But in any case, it became a terrifying thing for us because this slide occurred less than 110 feet away from the mansion. So it's like, okay, well, what's next? What's this going to look like? So just thinking about this problem and how we might go about solving it, we deployed our LiDAR imagery, and we did a drainage analysis of all the different, waterways that appear every time it rains, anytime it's wet. And what we ended up seeing were 3, very significant areas where water seems to channel and gravitate to. And the section where we had the wall failure was probably where the worst drainage was occurring. Drainage from the mansion roof was going downslope down there. The roadways, the plantation roadways have been regraded over time. We have to use a soil cement to keep everything together because of all the visitors that we get. So that created an impermeable surface, which then drained down the east lawn into this big channel. So once we had that sorted out, we were able to pass that information off to some civil engineers who are working with us on the drainage. But there are also 2 other areas that were problematic that we looked into. And as many of you know, it's been an incredibly wet summer. And by being able to head that problem off at the pass, because we had that LiDAR imagery flown, we were able to correct very quickly those 2 problem areas before they became another disaster for us. So, that's just one way from a maintenance perspective, and then from a historical perspective that the LiDAR is paying dividends. So it's not just a fun tool for research, but it is a lot of fun.
Our maintenance forum was after I showed him the LiDAR and all the things we could discover, historic road traces, some of the ditches, plow furrows. He became most excited when I located 3 septic fields he didn't know existed. So it's all in your perspective.
I'll just yell. So could you talk a bit more on the public archaeology programs? That's really cool.
Sure. Yeah. The public archaeology programs that we do, with public archaeology, we engage, of course, visitors that come to Montpelier on a daily basis, have a lab, and always have the lab open, public archaeology lab, and then also the site. But for the week-long programs, what we've been able to do is really generate a constituency who understands what the archaeology is, because they've been participating in digs. In some cases, we've got about 30% repeats, of the 1,100 people that have been on programs, about 30% of those repeat, every 1 or 2 years. And they've become a real ally in terms of not only, doing archaeology for research sake, but then also pushing the importance of preservation. And that's where, when Luke and I were talking about the LiDAR, GIS, and the ability to put this information online and make it accessible, I became most excited because all of a sudden, you know, for some archaeological data, in working with metal detectorists, they've advised us on what and what not to put online. Like, for example, they said, whatever you do, do not ever put where Civil War sites are online, because the, you know, very small percentage of metal detectorists that want to come out in the evening after dark it would give them a roadmap of where to go. But other sites where we can advertise, hey, we found 300 cut nails at this site. Not a lot of people are going to be interested in coming and finding cut nails, but these are witness sites for the enslaved community. And what we've really been doing is this. We're seeing the GIS and really the ability to put this online is giving these spaces back to the public, and especially the descendant community, in terms of spaces that they can understand, and really being able to there's some, you know, very weak claims that have been made, or you put a lot of this information online, such as 3D imagery, 3D exploration, who would want to come to the site? But, you know, it's the opposite. The more you know about a site virtually, the more you want to visit. But then also the more ownership you have over that, especially for these constituent groups that we're working with at Montpelier. So I'm not sure if that answered the question, and if you're interested more, I can send you to the website. It's www.montpelier.org/dig. So
there'll be a lot of plugs like that. Excuse me. So our public-facing archaeology program at Mount Vernon is a little bit of a smaller scale than what Matt and his team is able to deploy. But what we end up doing is we host an awful lot of undergrad and graduate students based on our location. We're kind of a target-rich environment, and I always encourage students to come write their thesis in a box or dissertation in a box. We have so many collections from very important archaeological sites which have never been analyzed to their fullest capacity. And as I mentioned, we're a team of 6. And I basically take myself out of that equation because I'm pushing paper most of the day. But what we end up doing is we offer the slave cemetery excavation to public participation. We have everybody fill out an application so they know exactly what they're getting into. They have to agree to abide by the Society for American Archaeology's Code of Ethics. And then, you know, we're able to essentially have a termination clause in case something doesn't work out. But we have never had to exercise that in the past 4 years of the work that we've been doing at the slave cemetery. So we run that program June through October, 2 days a week on Thursdays and Fridays, and basically we just require college age and above. Although we have had a couple very good mature high school students come out and work with us, and we supervise them, and they learn the fundamentals of archaeological excavation. As you can see from that story map that I showed, the great thing about working in the slave cemetery is there were only ever 2 uses for that landscape. A Native American site that's late archaic, so that's 5,000 years before present, and then the interment of the enslaved or maybe even emancipated individuals on that space. So, fortunately, we only have about 6 inches of soil to remove, and then you're there and you're hitting the tops of grave shafts. We're not actually excavating down to human remains because we just want to map the locations and figure out where they are, how they're arrayed. But then you're getting prehistoric material all over the place too. So it's, we like to think that it's a very gratifying experience, and you get to learn the fundamentals. And then also, based on our location in Northern Virginia, we have an immense retiree population, many of whom worked in civil service for the federal government, who are infatuated by Washington family history. So they help us process a lot of our artifacts in the lab. Every Wednesday, if you come to Mount Vernon, our small staff of 6 ends up managing about 24 people who are washing, bagging, labeling, processing. Many of these folks also have backgrounds in statistics and everything else too. So we've gotten a lot of good traction, and we've expanded our archaeological reach through that. But then the public-facing program also is enhanced through these digital platforms like the story maps, so that these things can kind of live on after people have visited the sites, after those who are working with us can kind of move on and share that too. So it's a pretty unique program, and we're very proud of what we've been able to build over the past couple of years. And digital technology has enhanced that.
Yeah, one thing I'd add to the public programs that we've done is we've involved the descendant community in the archaeology, and that in many ways, we just produced a new exhibit called Mere Distinction of Color at Montpelier. And that is basically crowdsourced from descendants that have come on excavations at the slave quarters. And it's their involvement in the archaeology and the research process that have given them ownership over that history. And from that, we've developed an interpretive program that is in many ways, it's with using the voices of descendants to reflect on the intersection between Constitution, slavery, and race today. And that, I think, has been the most inspiring part of the public programs that we've done. So.
I have a Montpelier question. I remember reading, I think a few years ago, an article in the newspaper about Montpelier, and I think you had found archaeological evidence that corroborated an anecdote that had been passed down in time, something about a wagon knocking a building over, and you had found the evidence of it, right? And it was gratifying, I guess, that the documentary evidence or the story and the archaeology had corroborated each other so well. And I was wondering if you found that corroboration got thinner or sparser as you moved away from the historic core of the landscape. So when you find these buildings through nails out in the landscape, are you also finding them on maps? Or do you have other written information that helps you identify what they are? And do you have that same kind of rich evidence for what that cultural landscape was like the farther you move away from the denser areas in the landscape?
Yeah, that one story that you mentioned is it's the threshing barn that we located, and the wayward stepson of James Madison from Dolly Madison's first marriage. He was unfortunately his place in life. He was a drunk, a gambler, had all the vices. After Dolly Madison sold the plantation, he came back about a week later and knocked down a barn to steal the threshing machine, and that's where we found the remains of that. It happened to corroborate, but unfortunately, about 8 years later, after John Payne Todd died, the stepson, he had all of the family documents at his house. And so James Madison's nieces and nephews went to his house, found 2 rooms full of documents, pulled them all out into the back lawn, decided that their Uncle Jimmy was too much of a very private man and didn't want these released to the public, and put a match to them. So everything that, the maps you have that I had to rule over, like showing the names of fields and the location of slave quarters, we're relying on the metal detector surveys for doing that. And what's really having sites like Mount Vernon and Monticello, where there's such amazing documentary sources, combining that information with LiDAR and then also survey allows us a model to understand, for example, some of these nail scatters that we're finding in LiDAR returns through a comparative basis. Because in a lot of cases, all of these plantations are based on slave labor. The agricultural techniques are shared between all of these plantations. There's no one plantation that was an island doing its own thing. They're literally trading workers, trading slaves, and so there's a lot of parallels between plantations, but it's the locating of the items that has been really helped with the LiDAR and then also with the metal detector survey. So necessity is the mother of invention. That's where a lot of some of the uniqueness that we're doing comes from is using LiDAR and then metal detecting. But yeah, as you get further away from the plantation, in these remote areas, the sites become more further apart. But then there's less information, especially at Montpelier for the documentary sources.
So we're running towards the end of time. We've got one last question. And then after that, we've got a little reception, and you can get the book on Mount Vernon and ask people questions individually.
First of all, thank you for being here tonight. I was wondering, I know that Ferry Farm and Mount Vernon are separate parent organizations, I believe, but they just recently completed their big recreation of the house there this past summer. Is there any talk of using this technology, the LiDAR and the digital technology, to look at that site? Or
Yeah, so we're George Washington's Mount Vernon is controlled by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association of the Union, MVLA. and they've been around since 1853 and stewards of the property outright since 1858. And Ferry Farm is run by, I believe they're just called the George Washington Foundation, and they were set up to preserve not only Ferry Farm, but then Kenmore Plantation is also under that umbrella, and that was another Washington family member. But I don't think that they're moving in the same direction with the digital technology and the landscape reconstruction that we are. You know, one thing that you know that they have that we don't is you know, a great site that's not mucked around with too terribly much by utilities and development and things like that. So they relied much more heavily on the archaeological evidence and then evidence from architectural historians to be able to complete their reconstruction of the Washington family home on that particular site. But in terms of deploying LiDAR, I think with the amount of acreage that they have to work with, it's not something that they necessarily want to get on the path of. As Matt can attest, I'm sure, you know, these things come with a price. So are the ends going to justify the means, right? And you know, I always tell people when you're working with new technology and deciding what you want to deploy and what the best route is to go, invest in people, not the technology. You know, you can always work around that, and there are many different partnerships that you can develop where you can get at the same thing for a very low cost.
Okay. Well, join me in thanking Matt and Luke. And we've got a small reception outside, and you can ask them questions individually as well. Thank you all for coming.